Well, welcome to this Educator's Corner. Today, we're going to talk about something that's very dear and near to my heart and how TV game shows have come to influence education. I'm going to talk about some tips, tricks, and some of the common pitfalls instructors fall into in using games. We'll also talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to using games as a training software. We need to talk about the ugly to understand what we need to avoid. My name is John Dillon, and not only am I the product development manager at C3 SoftWorks, I'm also a very experienced instructor going back to the early 80s, teaching a variety of topics at colleges, all different levels for most of my adult life. And about 20 years ago, I kind of really got into the using games to teach and review information. And because I really wanted to spice things up a little bit. But the most important thing is I wanted to find different ways to deliver the same content that I've been doing for years in PowerPoint. Because I had clients or I had people I had to teach every single year. So I was trying to find different ways to teach the same information. And games ended up being that magic bullet for me. Once I started mastering it a little bit, I started doing seminars and webinars on how to use games to deliver or teach information. And it was very interesting, especially in the early years. I had people that were very avid game users. They loved it. They were just excited when they came up to me talk, "Oh, I used a game last year. My students still talk about it." And then I had kind of a smaller group of people that are in the middle. I don't really have an opinion. I've never done it. I've seen it once or twice. Don't really have an opinion. Then I had a really strong amount of people in the group. They saw games more as icebreakers. They didn't really see it as a serious teaching tool. And sometimes they went as far as they felt the games dumbed down education. They felt it was just more time filler. It was just a waste of time. And unfortunately, the people that are very excited about using games, unfortunately, perpetuated this belief or creating this persona about games because they really weren't very effective in delivering content. Yes, it was fun, but it really didn't do a good job of delivering the material. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Most of our audiences are there to learn, not to have fun. And that's a big distinction we need to remember. It's okay to use fun to achieve your educational goals. But remember what your true objective is. That is to teach a topic. That's not to say from time to time you can't do something to have fun. But when you design training, you have a specific objective in mind. When I'm creating a training session, if it's for a live session or if it's for a webinar or if it's for self-paced, I need to clearly define my objectives. So when I get done with the training, I can self-assess, did I meet that objective, which is to educate? Again, what is your primary objective? So if I'm going to create something for educate, I can break it down even further. Is my objective to review content, which is the most common way people use games? Or is it to deliver new content, which I do a lot? Or is this a self-paced session? How I create training for one of those three is going to slightly vary. Or is this session really primarily to entertain? Is it really being used as just a filler of time or just something for fun? How I create that will be dramatically different than how I create it to educate. So it's very, very important distinctions, but clearly define your objective. And when you get done with the training, you need to be self-aware and self-analyze. Did you meet that objective? This is part of the training where I talk about my original venture into using games as a teaching tool. Over 20 years ago, I was tasked with teaching 150 employees over the next couple of weeks, probably one of the driest topics known to man. But I was taking a traditional PowerPoint presentation, which I've done many times, and I turned it into a game. I had 50 students the first session, and I'm going to try to keep this short. I will tell you, there's a lot of energy in the room. And when I got done that first night, people absolutely loved it. And one thing I always tell you to do is analyze your training. Not only did you achieve your objective. Now remember, my objective was not to entertain. My objective was to deliver content and make it educational. I was just using entertainment to help me reach my objective. From an entertainment standpoint, if that was my objective, I knocked it out of the park. You couldn't done any better than I did that night. However, when I analyzed it from an educational objective, As far as I'm concerned, I missed the mark completely. And what I did was the following couple of days, I talked with people that attended the training. I talked to managers who are in the training because this was mandatory. Everybody had to take it from the chief on down. And what I found is it really did miss the mark in the education. People loved it and they appreciated that, but I missed the mark on my educational objectives. That doesn't mean I'm going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It meant that I needed to start tweaking how I presented. Over the next year, I started to tweak my presentation to be more effective, how to control the group more. I found the less I played it like a game show, the more effective it was at reaching my objectives. And I'm not going to share all my experiences, but the key thing is I slowed down the session. I added content that preceded questions. I added content that followed the questions. I talked about why questions were right or why questions were wrong. I found unique ways to really slow down the session, control the content, control the energy. In the end, it was still enjoyable for the students to attend, but in a much more controlled atmosphere. Most importantly, I was able to achieve my educational objectives. Here are my two big points I want to make. I call these the false positives that many educators initially fall into when using games to teach. The first is that class absolutely loved it. As I've discussed, just because the class loved it doesn't mean it's educational. The second thing is just because it contains content, therefore it's educational. And that is a false statement, because we all have seen plenty of PowerPoint presentations that are full of information and you walked away and got nothing out of it. At least the game's enjoyable. Content doesn't equal education. I like to say PowerPoint and games are very similar. In fact, how I use a game is very similar to how I use PowerPoint, and I'm going to talk about that. Good instructors will learn how to use these tools effectively to achieve their educational objectives. So how do most instructors learn to use games? For the most part, it's watching other people, but also probably the biggest influence, without question, is going to be television, specifically television game shows. Jeopardy, by far, is the biggest influencer on instructors using games. Jeopardy goes back to 1964. I saw different iterations of Jeopardy games in the classroom when I was in high school. I'm not going to say the years, but it was a long time ago. Before computers never even existed. The point I'm trying to make is, if this is people's inspiration, it's okay to use something familiar, but you have to understand that a game show's objective is much different than yours in the classroom. And I want to reiterate, the more you try to follow the rules of a game show that you see on TV in the classroom, you're probably going to miss your mark on your educational objectives. I always like to say games are educational with a purpose. Really, I use games like I use PowerPoint, and I'm going to talk about that, but really, that's how I use a game. And it really are, if you have some control factors and just some basic things you follow, you can really get a lot out of a game and make it a very effective teaching tool. Not just to review, but actually deliver content. The other thing I like to add is, specifically today, when you have smart devices that can interact directly with the software, you really get real-time feedback. And this is powerful. And by the way, I love wrong answers. Sometimes I will create questions and put in wrong answers that are the common misunderstandings of a topic. And I do that to exploit weaknesses so I can talk about it in the classroom. So don't miss that opportunity. We're not a television show where you just give the correct answer. Take the time. Talk about why an answer is correct. Why are people getting this wrong? Especially if it's something we reviewed. It'll help you identify weaknesses. And the platform will actually tell you how your audience is responding. Well, so far up to this time, we kind of talked about the good, the bad, and ugly of using game software. Now, I'm just going to show you just a few examples of how I will use questions, not only review content, but deliver content that may be new to a student. Here's the BRAVOZONE, and we're kind of focusing today on game show type games, and we have two of those, Quiz Show and Millionaire, which plays like a Millionaire game. but they are distinctly different and have kind of different functionality. They're just similar, which is what we play to. So there's 10 templates to choose from self-paced, learning management, to instructor-led. What I want to do is go to a game I've already created, and you'll see our game board here behind the scenes. I'm going to click on this first question, and I want to show you a few things. Remember, I talked about I always like to go beyond the question and the answer. To me, a game board is a lot like PowerPoint. So in this particular example, I've actually added a preview slide. Now I just have an image here, but I can add some text as well. Sometimes I'll actually use the preview slide to set up a question, especially if the question is a little lengthy. But in this situation, I want to talk about something before I get to the question. This allows me to control the pace of the session. And then I'm going to ask my question. And you can have, in Quiz Show, you have 4 different choices to choose from, but some of our other platforms have up to 7 or 8 or more different types of questions. And you can choose which is the correct answer. It's pretty straightforward. But most importantly, we also have the ability to add a summary slide. So in this case, we have an image and some text. And the summary slide can be related to the question or set up the next question. It's really up to you. But I like to go beyond the question and the answers. And I think what most instructors fail at is they read the question and they acknowledge the answer and they move on. It will take me on average about 50 minutes to go through 25 questions. Let's see what this looks like in the classroom. So you'll see here we have a game board, somewhat similar to Jeopardy, but the similarities kind of are limited. I'm going to go ahead and choose a category. I personally like to control what category and what question we're going to answer. A lot of times I'll set this board up for instructor-led to answer questions in a very sequential order. That allows me to build upon the previous information. But that's up to you, and that depends on how you build the session. I'm going to click on my first question here. And you see here I have a preview slide, which I can go ahead and enlarge, talk about this just like I would in the classroom. So I like to use a lot of the content within the game like I use PowerPoint. So I can talk about this for a couple minutes, then advance and ask my question. I have a simulated audience of 20 people here. So they've actually all answered. If this is a live session, my audience will be using smart devices to interact directly with my presentation. I'm going to go ahead and advance. And what I see is how people answer. Now, these answers are kind of arbitrary because this is simulated, but you'll see the correct answer is actually brachial. So even though the majority of people got it wrong, we actually have answers across the board. This helps me identify weaknesses real time. In fact, I can say, well, why do people think D is the answer? So I can actually have a discussion within the session. See, this is my way of controlling the pace and using the game effectively to not only review content, but to deliver new content. Once I'm done, I can also then review information. And again, I have an image in here with some text and I can talk about that. And that's pretty much it. It really is about controlling the pace of your session and not necessarily following the actual rules of a game show like you see in TV, but basically following your own rules. You're finding different ways to engage your audience. It's great to create excitement, but you don't want that excitement to be counterproductive and actually distract from your objective. I have found using games in the classroom extremely successful, but it's taken me a little practice. You have to get your game feet, but once you do, you're off and running. Well, that's it. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to reach out to us at support@c3softworks.com and check in again. We're going to have plenty of these types of lessons that are available online.